Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final event of our year-long virtual series, Out of the Frame. The historical record is marked by events, people, and communities that remain just outside of the frame. They are there, clearly visible, but no one pays attention to them, and we should. Out of the Frame aims to center these long overlooked topics and groups. I thank our series partners, NYU's Professor Emerita of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Marian Kaplan, and Stockton University Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide, Raz Segal. I thank, too, Center Associate Juan Acevedo, Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, and the GC's terrific IT people, Steve Weiss, Brad Holscher, Steve Thomas, and Eric Williard. Above all, I am grateful to our guest speakers, to my colleague Zachariah Mampili, the genius behind this event, and to everyone who is tuned in. Thank you for joining. It is now my pleasure to say a few words about Zachariah, who serves as panel chair and moderator. It is he who will have the honor of introducing our guest speakers. Professor Mampili holds the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at CUNY. He is also a member of the doctoral faculty in the Department of Political Science here at the Graduate Center. Co-founder of the Program on African Social Research, Professor Mampili is the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, and, with Adam Branch, Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change. A master of the short form, in addition to book-length publications, Professor Mampili's essays have appeared in a range of publications, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, The Hindu, Al Jazeera, and the Washington Post. Zachariah, with my deep thanks, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for this very generous introduction indeed, and thank you to all the center affiliates for making this event possible. It's really wonderful to be here today to discuss, obviously, some very difficult situations in the Congo and Sudan, and I'm really, really grateful and excited to have two amazing speakers here. I can't really think of anyone better to talk about these two countries. And to also help us sort of connect them to a lot of the other cases that we are interested in at the center, cases of genocide, mass violence across the world. So we will have only about an hour for this discussion. My goal here is to try to provide an overview. I assume that many of the folks, we have over 60 people online who are watching, may not be particularly experts on these two cases. As the event series title makes clear, these are hugely important countries that don't necessarily receive the kind of attention that they deserve. And so our goal here is to try to help those of you who have tuned in by providing a broad overview of the crises ongoing in both countries, and also to draw connections between what's happening in Sudan and Congo and conflicts elsewhere in the world. I want to keep my comments very brief so I can introduce our two wonderful speakers for today. Let me just say one thing about our format here. I will ask both Nisrin and Fred to provide a quick overview of the situations in both Congo and Sudan to get us started. Then I prepared about 3 or 4 questions, and I encourage them to answer as they see fit. And hopefully we'll have at least about 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat function, and I will be monitoring those in order to pose them to our panelists on your behalf. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both Fred and Nisrin. First up, we have Fred Bauma. Fred is the Executive Secretary of Ebuteli, a research institute based in Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is also a senior fellow at the NYU Center on International Cooperation and a human rights activist and member of Lutte pour la Changement, the most important pro-democracy movement in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Fred was arrested in March 2015 and spent 18 months in prison, where he faced the death penalty. Amnesty International declared Bauma a prisoner of conscience and awarded LUCHA the Ambassador of Conscience Award in 2016. Fred is also a co-founding member of Afriki, a network of over 30 movements from Africa and its diaspora. And with Jason Stearns, Fred co-hosts the Ukombozi podcast, a podcast run by the Program on African Social Research here at CUNY, that looks at African social movements and the worlds that they're trying to create. And I also mentioned that Fred is a proud graduate of the Master's in Public Administration program at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs. Next up, we have Nisrin Elamin. Nisrin is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the African Studies program at the University of Toronto. Prior to joining the University of Toronto, she taught at Bryn Mawr College and was a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows at Columbia University. Her work investigates the connections between land, race, belonging, and empire making in Sudan and the broader Sahel region. She uses land and struggles over land as a lens through which to examine state surveillance of Sahelian migration, as well as Gulf Arab corporate investments and political interventions in Sudan and neighboring countries. Before pursuing a PhD, Elamin spent over a decade working as an educator, researcher, and organizer in the United States and taught for several years in Tanzania. And I should also mention that Nisrin is from Sudan and has been very involved in the pro-democracy movement there since at least 2019. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to start by asking both of you to just briefly describe the current situation in Congo and Sudan in about 5 minutes. And with the awareness that we have a very educated audience here, but many of them may not be particularly familiar with the complex histories of both countries. So maybe Fred, you want to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Zach, and nice to see you again, Nisrin. And thank you for this opportunity to discuss the situation in DRC and also in Sudan. So to be very brief, currently Congo is facing, let's say, multiple crises, especially in the eastern side of the country, in few of the provinces. This is due to armed conflicts that has lasted now for probably the last 30 years. It's a conflict that is in most of the parts linked to the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide and rebellions that were like the massive displacement of refugees in that region and rebellions that followed. But especially on the current situation, I would like to draw attention to one particular armed group, that is M23, which has its roots in few more armed group that mobilize around protection of some communities, but which actions have caused massive massive violations and crimes and displacement of many people. So this is a group that started 12 years ago. It was defeated in 2012 and regained influence 3 years ago now, with massive military support by Rwanda, and it is operating in North Kivu, Eastern DRC, the region where I'm from. And in three years of its action, it has been able to occupy large territories of North Kivu. So this is territories that are larger than Rwanda itself, and it has caused massive movement of population. In 3 years ago, the number of displacement in DRC was around 3 million. And today we have 7.3 million of displaced people, including around 1 million in the last 4 months. Most of these people are around the city in eastern DRC called Goma, around 1 million of these. And this is a city where a city of almost a million or 1.5 million population that Zach visited with me a few months ago. And so a city of that size is actually welcoming almost the same amount of people in terms of refugees. So you can imagine the level, the humanitarian crisis that comes with. Another consequence of this new rebellion is that the response to it, in responding to it, the government decided to rearm local militias. We are definitely not taking lessons for what is happening in Sudan. And so those militias around the cities, there are a lot of them, both pretending to take guns because of patriotic reasons, but it's creating more chaos in the city with a lot of killings within Goma, over-militarization of many cities, looting of civilians' houses. And so it's just increasing the level of despair within the population. I will probably end by saying that this group, as well as other armed groups, has committed a lot of atrocities in eastern DRC, including massacres of civilians and women and girl rapes in several villages. And I think one of the reason why this continued to happen after more than 30 years is also because of impunity, because all the ways different government, the Congo's government, as well as the pressure of the US and other countries to resolve this problem has always been by integrating these rebels into institutions. So it kind of incentivizes the use of guns and violence, and the civilian population are finally, at the end, the one who are paying the high cost. So in brief, and this doesn't give justice to the context, but I hope we can have time to discuss other deeply in a few minutes.
Thank you. Nisrin?
Yes, I also just wanted to say thank you to Deborah and to Zach and to Fred for inviting me to be part of this, and I'm really honored to kind of share to be in dialogue with you. I prepared some remarks. They should be about 5 minutes long, just because I'm not as good as Fred at just sort of So anyway, I'm going to read them. So a year ago this week, a brutal war broke out in Sudan between two factions of a military regime that grabbed power in October of 2021, attempting to crush a powerful popular revolution which overthrew the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir after 30 years of power. The roots of this war can be traced back several decades, I would say, to the beginning of Sudan's first civil war in 1955, during which elites in Sudan Center violently repressed South Sudanese dissent and exploited land, labor, and natural resources in the country's peripheries to fuel this violent campaign of repression that later extended to areas like Darfur and the Nuba Mountains in order to accumulate wealth and consolidate their political and economic control over the country. And we saw this need to protect elite interests in Sudan manifest itself in the last couple of decades in an ethno-nationalist, monocultural, right-wing religious project being imposed on a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways, repressing kind of dissent and legitimate demands for political representation and economic justice. We saw this play itself out in Darfur, for example, where a state-sanctioned campaign of genocidal violence led by the Janjaweed, now known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, was carried out beginning in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands, and wiping out entire villages of African identified people and displacing millions of Sudanese civilians. And so, this war, which erupted in the capital Khartoum last April, which I witnessed the beginnings of, can in some ways be seen as the kind of latest phase of the long war coming to the capital and center of power, and I think should also be understood as a counter-revolutionary war. From Khartoum, the war spread quickly to various parts of the country like Darfur, Kordofan, and a few months ago hit the Jazeera, which is the agricultural heartland of the country where I do my research. The war has been used as a cover to reanimate and intensify ethnic cleansing campaigns against people in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains. And this counter-revolution is not only an internal power struggle between two generals vying for economic and political control of the country, but it's very much embedded in a broader transnational struggle for control over Sudan's resources, its strategic position along the Red Sea, and power in the region. On one side of this war, we have the RSF, led by General Hemeti, formerly known as the Janjaweed, whose leaders control much of the illicit gold trade in the country, which gets funneled through the gold markets of the UAE and sold to Russia and other countries. In exchange for gold, the UAE is shipping in weapons and military equipment to the RSF via Chad and Libya. And then on the other hand, we have the army and its allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who controlled, before the war, almost 70% of Sudan's economy, close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, cement, and construction, which are in turn backed by Gulf financing and have close ties to Egypt's Sisi, and they most recently have received support from Iran and Ukraine as well. The RSF, which was created by al-Bashir as part of a coup-proofing strategy against the army, was legitimized by something called the Khartoum Process in 2014, to which the European Union externalized its border to the region between Sudan and Libya by paying the RSF 200 million to violently stem the migration of East Africans into Europe through deportations and detentions. Both warring factions sent troops to fight in the war on Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf, thereby expanding their transnational networks of support. The Saudis and Emiratis have invested tens of billions of dollars in Sudanese land, real estate, and infrastructure over the last decades, and can hence not be seen as neutral peace brokers. Jeddah, for example, has hosted negotiations between the warring parties. The UAE signed a $6 billion port deal with Sudanese elites about a year before this war, which never materialized, but was meant to undermine Sudan's national port and to expand their control over networks of production and distribution across the Horn of Africa. And to me, they're one of the major external actors fueling this war that are benefiting, of course, through this illicit gold trade. And it's only, I think, through external pressure by the US and other Western allies, by bringing them also to the negotiation table, that we might see them shift their role. And again, I want to say briefly that this war is an extension of the counter-revolution that emerged in the aftermath of the ouster of al-Bashir, as an attempt to sideline and repress the radical elements of the revolution that were demanding a full transition to civilian rule. In particular, it's a war against grassroots civil society formations. And the backbone of them, I would say, are these neighborhood resistance committees, of which there are about 8,000 across the country, but also independent farmer and labor unions, professional associations, feminist organizations, youth and student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly resisted NGOization and formal opposition party politics. So I think, to me, it's a war against the resistance committee's vision of a popular democracy from the bottom up, as it is kind of outlined in their revolutionary charters. And I'll just end with this. Sudan's entire population of 45 million, including many of my family members, is currently caught in the middle of this senseless war. 25 million are at the brink of famine in a country that could easily feed itself and the entire region. 19 million children are out of school, and the healthcare system has largely collapsed. Over 70% of hospitals are no longer functioning amidst an emerging dengue fever outbreak. Over 10 million people are displaced, making Sudan the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, and yet no country has, to my knowledge, created a special visa for Sudanese refugees. 1 in every 8 displaced persons in the world is Sudanese, yet the international aid community has largely been absent, and Sudan's 7 borders remain very difficult to cross. Until the Paris conference that just happened this week, only 2.6% of the 2.7 billion in international aid funding needed to launch a robust relief effort, has been received by the international community, and most aid is being obstructed by the warring factions. In the midst of this, and this is my last point, the revolution in Sudan continues, led by young volunteers who are filling this gap left by the state and a largely absent international aid community. The same young people who were the backbone of the revolution, many of them members of the resistance committees, have created emergency response rooms and are now leading food and medicine distribution efforts, organizing communal kitchens, driving ambulances, coordinating evacuations, setting up ad hoc emergency clinics and rape crisis centers, converting defunct schools into shelters, restoring public services, and retrieving and burying dead bodies. These are young people who should be in university or organizing to build the foundations of a popular democracy from the bottom up, but are instead being tasked with putting out fires and with supporting the nearly 50 million fellow Sudanese survive this war. And I just want to mention, because this was not mentioned in my bio, I'm a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective here in Toronto, which has been supporting these emergency response rooms on the ground. And so if you're interested in supporting, you can go to sudansolidarity.com. And so I'll just end right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisrin, and thank you, Fred, as well. You know, the scale of the conflicts that both of you are describing are truly extraordinary. The numbers are almost beyond belief. We're talking about people, you know, tens of millions of people being affected by both of these conflicts, which is unsurprising when we consider how big these countries are. It can be difficult, I think, for people who are not familiar with Africa to understand just how big Congo is, how big Sudan is. But to give you some sense of scale, you know, Congo itself is about the size of Western Europe, and Sudan is not much smaller. So you have, you know, two of the four largest countries on the continent that are facing these massive crises on a scale that, you know, really evokes, you know, perhaps the Second World War, right? And yet they have not received nearly as much attention as they deserve. I think, as both of you are pointing out, the response from both international and national level agencies has been pitiful. People have been left to fend for their own needs, to survive under extremely difficult circumstances. So I want to ask you both to perhaps provide a little bit more of what Nisrin left off, which is, how are people surviving, right? How are the people that you know? Fred, of course, you are in Congo right now. How do people survive amidst such difficult circumstances? You know, if you have any personal stories, not necessarily personal stories, but individual stories, I think that can help humanize, you know, these two conflicts, which are in some ways, when you describe them with numbers, almost beyond human comprehension to understand the scale of the violence that is unfolding. Nisrin, do you want to start, because you were already raising this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start with my own kind of story and thinking about how when I was in Khartoum last April, we would have never been able to get out without the young people of like our neighborhood resistance committee showing us kind of how to get out of the city. They've been the ones who are bringing water, for example, until recently, to my uncle who refused to leave his neighborhood in Khartoum from the Nile every night because you know, immediately electricity and water was out for a very, very long time. And so I think, I mean, for me, I mean, these are really the unsung heroes, you know, are the people who are behind these emergency response rooms. And they were created in part because there was a shortage of fuel, cooking fuel. And so people kind of out of necessity decided, okay, if we're going to have to feed people, we should do it through these communal kitchens. And so that's one of the, I think, key elements of the emergency response rooms, is that they're building community and bringing people together, feeding families at, you know, one meal a day in their neighborhoods. And I should say a lot of these young people, you know, could leave the country. They have a lot of them tend to be more middle class, certainly in Khartoum at least. They have the, you know, the passport, the resources to leave, but have decided to stay. And I think that in of itself tells you something about people's kind of dedication to mutual aid, to also just remaining kind of steadfast in the face of really unimaginable state violence, and to say, you know, we're not moving, we're going to stay here and we're going to fight until we get, you know, back on the path towards civilian rule. And so I think, yeah, that I guess that it's really the emergency response rooms for me that encapsulate and embody this kind of resilience. I don't like the word resilience that much, but I'm reminded of Mariam Kaba's kind of point that hope is a discipline. And I think it takes a lot of discipline, a lot of a lot of tenacity and hope, really, right? To kind of maintain this kind of labor in the face of targeted violence. So these emergency response room leaders are being targeted by the army, by the RSF. They're being imprisoned, tortured. Rape is being used as a weapon of war against them and other civilians. And yet, you know, people are continuing to do this really important life-saving work. So.
Right.
I mean, it's almost the same thing that Nisrin is describing. A concrete example, I live in my family lives in Goma, and I live in Goma part of that time. And there is maybe few ways I can say how people survive. One way is the local solidarity. I'm part of this group called Goma Active that is made of young people. Most of them are much younger than me, so they're in their 20s. And since the beginning of this conflict, they've decided to go and give food almost every day to kids in displacement camp. So they organize a movement of solidarity in the city, collect some small amount of money and clothes, and go to the displacement camps to cook for those displaced people, and sometimes mobilize voluntary physicians to go and provide some help. And these are people who were born for the large majority after the beginning of the war. And so the reality under which they are acting is the only thing they have known for many years. And so you will see that, I mean, the more you talk to these people, I feel like it gives sense to like going and helping and providing assistance that otherwise would be absent to those displaced people. Give hope to themselves, but also as it lasts long, they start lacking alternatives. So they are surviving, but I wonder how long they can survive in that situation. But at the same time, so this is, for example, in around Goma, a NAM group that in the past has been defeated and started again, and people who are moving from the displaced people from those villages are sometimes people who have been displaced for more than 3 times or 4 times in the last decade. So you go in the displacement camp and you talk to families, families that I was collecting like food for 10 years ago, 12 years ago. You see them in the same camp. They came back, and they are coming back more than one time, and all of them are telling us they don't want to live in those camps. They want to go back in their houses, and in fact their houses sometimes is just a few kilometers away, and they can't they can't go in the condition they are living in such as they if they had an opportunity to go, they will go. In some villages, including mine, you hear the stories of old people who just refuse to leave. Even if the village become empty, some of those people will say, okay, I can't leave anymore. If they want to kill me, I'll wait here for them to come. But they decide to resist. So you see, I don't know if it's surviving, or if it's a way to live another day only. But that's the situation people are in. And in this camp, you will actually find people who are trying to, like, what something that affected me a lot is the situation of kids, for example, in those camp. When we go, so usually when young like people of Goma Tif, when we go in those camp, what we do is some group will be through cooking with displaced people, and some of them will be trying to play with the kids and organize them, and sometimes give them help them paint something or clean their clothes. And these kids do not know what will happen to them in, tomorrow or the day after. And you see them as normal kids living like, I don't know if they understand what is happening, but when I see them, I wonder, would they see tomorrow? Well, where would they be tomorrow? And you see this in this camp, young people again, sometimes even under 18, are starting to take guns because it is becoming the only way for them to find meaning to what is happening to their life. So I don't know if it's probably surviving. I won't use also resilience, but I think they are reaching their limits, and as if it lasts long, I wonder what surviving will mean tomorrow.
Yeah, I wanna follow up because I had the opportunity to join Fred to visit some of these camps when I was with him in Goma almost a year ago now. And what struck me was the total lack of an international presence. And to give you a sense, Goma is one of the most international cities in the world. It has been the epicenter of the conflict in Congo. Since the late 1990s, it has the largest United Nations mission in the history of the United Nations peacekeeping. And yet, in these camps, there were at least 9 circling the city of Goma when we were there. There were almost no international actors present, no UN forces, no non-governmental organizations. And the people who were living in this camp, predominantly women and children, almost 1,000 of them, had their needs met solely by these young people associated with the group Goma Active, as Fred is talking about. And this sort of raises my question for both of you, which I think is related to something that Deborah Hurd has put into the chat as well, around the question of the international community. And I want to ask this in a way that allows you to reflect on perhaps some of the larger theoretical themes we are interested in at the center, which is, how should we understand the role of the international community in these conflicts? I think, as Nisrin sort of made clear in her comments, it is certainly not a benevolent force. Both Congo and Sudan, the conflict is often driven as much by external forces as it is by internal forces. And yet, the overwhelming image of African conflicts in particular is that the international community is a savior, right? That if we can only bring more awareness and attention to what is happening in Sudan and Congo, that would stimulate international action that could improve the conditions for people in places like Congo and Sudan. And so I want you just to talk a little bit more about how you think about the international, right? Is it the case, as I think Deborah's question is getting at, that we want all of these international actors who are engaged in these nefarious things out of these countries altogether? Is there a way to separate out, the good international actors from the bad international actors? Would these countries be better off had they remain outside of the, say, international capitalist world order altogether? Just how do you think about this? Because I think it is a really important question here for activism around these two countries, right? And whether or not this sort of strategy of trying to appeal to international audiences is one that you have any faith in and think could actually improve the conditions on the ground, or are people in both of these countries more cynical about the role of the international community and attribute many of the woes that they face to the particular positions that these two countries operate within the global economic system? I know that's a big question, so I don't know if one of you, maybe Nisrin, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very important question. I think, the international community during the transition period really sidelined the kind of more radical elements of the revolution in sort of coordination, I would say, with civilian elites. The formation of the transitional government involved a process of sort of sidelining the voices of the street, the radical elements of the revolution, in favor of civilian elites who were kind of interested in opening Sudan up after decades of kind of Clinton-era sanctions, right, to kind of international donor funding. And because power was always tilted in favor of the military elites within the transitional government, they were unable to really push through political reforms. And so we saw this kind of turning outward of the elites in the transitional government to the international community, appealing for donor support. And that's, I think, that was one of the fatal mistakes, because at the same time, after the coup in 2021, the UN then came in, led by the US, the UK, and I think the UAE as well, to kind of, instead of holding Hemeti and Burhan accountable for staging a coup and also for the war crimes that they've committed that kind of span decades, they were propped up as potential reformists that could get us closer to civilian rule. And the Sudanese civilians knew all along that that was never going to be the case, that they never had the intention of moving us towards civilian rule, and hence kind of that sort of lack of accountability and framing them as reformists paved the way for this war. And so I think there we see the role of international diplomacy in really rejecting the calls from the streets, from the resistance committees that were saying no, the 3 no's, right? No partnership, no legitimacy, and no negotiations with the military. And that was really sort of ignored. And now I think the case of Sudan is one where there are lots of negative forms of engagement that need to stop, that are about, exploiting Sudan's resources, gaining kind of, control over its strategic position along the Red Sea, where, these actors are not interested in a popular democracy from the bottom up because of the ways it will threaten their interests, right, and their investments, and so forth. And so for me, I take a kind of, page out of the book, I don't know what the saying is, but I basically follow kind of my Haitian friends, right, who say, like, take a hands-off approach. Certainly once we get to full ceasefire, and hopefully a transition to civilian rule, I think that's when I would like to see us, certainly in the global north, advocate for much, much less intervention, and to sort of hold the, we haven't even talked about the corporate network of whether it's weapons manufacturing companies, mining companies. I'm in Toronto, in Canada. 60% of mining companies are registered here. Certainly we know that they play a big role in the Congo, and they do in Sudan as well because of its gold. And so for me, positioned here, it's about holding that kind of corporate network of murderers, really, if you want to name it what it is, accountable for their crimes. One of the mining companies in Toronto they had a mining gala a couple weeks ago. They won an award. At the same time, they were in discovery for aiding and abetting war crimes in Sudan that led to the Sudanese government clearing oil fields, bombarding villages, right, and so forth, at the very beginning of the genocide in Darfur. So that also gives you an idea, I think, of, and we don't know that much about these, the Canadian PR company that is representing the RSF, for example. It's not in the media for a reason. I think it's obviously about anti-Black racism, but it's also about the ways that people are trying to protect elite interests. And so, for me, my politics are sort of more aligned with the resistance committees have never been given the space, never been taken seriously as political actors to actually actualize their revolutionary charters. And some of that has to do with international diplomatic interference, I would say. And certainly the fact that we haven't gotten closer to a permanent ceasefire has to do with external actors trying to protect their interests.
Thank you, Nisrin. Fred?
I think I would say probably the role of the international community in DRC, I can summarize it in 3 words. The first one is fatigue. The second one is cynicism, and maybe the other one is wrong or short, very short-termist solutions, if there are solutions at all. Fatigue, because this is a conflict that has lasted for many years, many decades now, and usually when you talk to diplomats here and there, here in other capitals, you hear a lot of them saying, this has lasted forever, it will never be resolved, almost that kind of language, and so they call it Congo fatigue. I think on the ground there is, and this is what probably they don't realize, there is a lot of fatigue toward the international community from Congolese side. And this is probably why you don't see municipal cars in Congo, in Goma, even if there is a massive presence of the MONUSCO, is because that fatigue and that idea that they are here, they are powerful potentially, and they don't do anything, led people to start attacking some of the UN cars and some of the NGOs cars. And so the UN mission in Goma decided to go low profile, because this fatigue and the cynicism also comes, maybe is based on a big gap between what international community sees as a solution or a temporary solution and what people want to be a solution. For example, one example is the idea of protection of civilian. We see in all resolutions on the MONUSCO, for example, that protection of civilians is one of the biggest mandate of the UN mission in DRC, and yet people see the same warlord, the same criminals, to name them, go in the bush, come back as a member of the government, go back in the bush, and people being killed, people being massacred and raped. And sometimes you look at numbers and they're like, okay, there is some progress in terms of protection of civilian. But what is protection of civilian if for the same civilian who fled 12 years ago are the one who are again in the displacement camp, are the one whose parents fled RCD, AFDL, and other more than 20 years ago. And so you have this discussion in New York on almost auto-congratulation of all the big work that the UN has done, and yet the daily reality of people is still very difficult. The same goes with the international community discourse on elections, for example, which is just becoming a tool for legitimizing the actions. And to some extent, to a large extent, I think, as in Sudan, the use of election is becoming more and more a counter-revolutionary thing. In 2018, for example, the almost US-sponsored rigged election, like rigged solution to the rigged election, was very anti-revolutionary, and it helped preserve a system of predation in DRC, which is in most parts responsible for the conflict that we're seeing today. And so the reaction in people in the general population is like more and more people don't really think the international community will resolve this conflict, but at the same time, there is a lot of interest at play. Gold, timber, coltan, and cacao are a big part of the world economy in Eastern DRC, and we find ourselves in the middle of China and the US competition because of cobalt and other minerals. So even if the action of this international community is being negative in large part, especially or insignificant in resolving conflict, their influence, at least outside of circles where Congolese people who directly influence is continuing to grow, and the intent that like the willingness to have governments in Kinshasa that is guarantee interests of one party or another is a strategic goal for many, China as well as the US as well as other people, regardless if this bring more peace or more conflict to people on the ground. And this may result in just a big disconnection between Kinshasa, the capital, and cities in remote places, and as well as a disconnection between the discourse of the international community and the expectations and actions of people in social movements on the ground.
Okay, I want to ask a follow-up question here based on what we've been getting in the chat. So I'm going to try to summarize, well, not summarize, just to simplify questions from three people. From Megan Olson and her high school freshman class who have joined us. Welcome, all of you. Edward Kissy and Yanis Ziligakis. They all want to sort of drill down on the question that we just started discussing, which is the role of more specific actors. We've been talking about the international community and the kind of complicated role that it is playing in both of these crises. But I'm asking if you could talk more specifically about certain actors that they have an interest in. Kissy would like to know more about, what we hear often, the possibility of African solutions to African crises. Is there a particular role for institutions like the African Union in both Sudan and Congo? Do you see this as positive or negative, an improvement over, say, the international community? Megan Olson's high school class asks a bunch of questions here, but I want to foreground specifically the role of the United States. Do you think the United States has a role to play here? How would you assess the role of the United States? Should it, what sort of advice might you give to the Biden administration if they wanted to improve their responses to both of these countries? And finally, from Ziligakis, a specific question about kind of the changing position of Africa within the global order. And in particular, we hear a lot about the role of Russia and China, Russia in Sudan in particular, and China in Congo in particular. How does this sort of shifting geostrategic context impact the conflicts in both of these countries? So obviously a lot here. Don't feel the need to respond to it all. We only have about 13 minutes left, but if there's any part of this, specifically the United States role, the African Union's role, or the role of, let's say, rising Asia, Russia and China in particular, that you would want to comment on. Fred, do you want to go first this time?
Yes, I think the narrative of African solution to African problem is interesting, but I don't think that has been useful anywhere. The African Union is a very weak institution. It's mostly very influenced by many of these autocrats that we are denouncing, and it hasn't been able anywhere, I think, to become a solution to conflict in DRC. Somehow there is a huge responsabilization of the international community altogether, be the African Union or the SADC or Eastern African Community recently, or the UN. So the discourse of African solution to African problem will only lead us to putting few autocrats in the same room and trying to find a balance that will probably not look at people's solution. Maybe there is a need for a more radical solution for African people by people and social movements across the continent to try to actually influence and shift power in these institutions, because I personally cannot expect anything from peace and security forums of African Union or any institution of AU. Actually, if you look at the rigged elections in many countries, or the coup d'etat, to say the African Union hasn't been able to do anything. the US, at least with regard to DRC and this last conflict, the US has been vocal in their statements and probably in diplomatic actions, but they have far more tools that they could use toward their former sponsor, like the allies, Rwanda and Uganda and some of these countries that they are not using. The traffic of coltan and gold is something that they can have influence on. They have military cooperation of they had at least with Rwanda, I think they still have, and Uganda, and they could use their sanction mechanism on some of this country, and they are not doing it. Statements from the State Department or the White House are sometimes powerful, but the actions do not follow. And I think they have ways of doing anything if they want. Now there's maybe a few words on the changing position on Africa. It is interesting, I think, that China and Russia are becoming. China is always become is always a major actor, but on the political and military aspect, Russia also. What I see mostly is not it's not like liberation. It's more from many countries to go from U.S. influence to China or to Russian influence, and in some regard continue to perpetuate the same thing, like in some countries like Burkina. That's what I'm seeing. It can help in Congo. I think this shift on position is helping a lot the Congo's government, because as in the Cold War, they are using their position like it is a tool to keep the US in line somehow, and to say, if you don't do this, we will go see the Chinese or the Russians. So it has been used very effectively by people in power, and maybe in the future, if power shifts, it may be used by other people. But the challenge of African people, I think, is to really gain like freedom and independence from all these foreign power, and to avoid meeting ourselves to one or another, to be able to provide peace and security to our people, and to be independent in how we choose who we want to collaborate with, and not become a protectorate of a new power or a former one.
Nisrin?
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that Fred was saying about the role of the African Union and its sort of weakness. I mean, I think right after the coup, if I remember this correctly, Sudan was still kind of chairing the African Union. They did not condemn the coup. There's a way that Egypt's role in the African Union has also, undermined prospects for certainly a transition to civilian rule. And I think while I think, ideally we would have African solutions to African problems, in the case of Sudan, you see the ways that Chad and Libya and Egypt, to a degree as well, are being influenced by, for example, the Gulf actors that I mentioned before. And so, there's still entanglements there that would need to be, challenged. And so I think there's a way that these that we have to. I mean, there's several tracks happening around the negotiations to bring us closer to a ceasefire, and that has been part of the problem. It's really hard to actually even keep track of all the different tracks. There's been one in Jeddah. There's been one, initiated by IGAD, the African Union. There was one in Egypt, and none of them have brought all of the actors that need to be at the table together. And so there needs to be, I think, a more coordinated effort by the international community to bring everybody together. It should be located on the continent. There is no reason why these negotiations that have gotten the most weight, certainly because the US has backed them, should take place in Jeddah. I also think we have to think about the role that Egypt is playing in relation to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and kind of water, and the ways that right before the war, you know, Sudan was sort of siding more with Egypt, and so this is partly Egypt's interest here, and Sisi's support of Burhan, who have a personal relationship, I think is also tied to that. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's really about people solutions, right? The people, like, you know, grassroots civil society, like the resistance committees, are the ones who should be dictating what the solutions to this crisis is and what a transition to civilian rule looks like, without any interference by the international actors that we've already mentioned. Yeah, and then I think there was maybe something about the US, but I think I feel like I already answered that. In many ways, I think the Gulf actors are much, because of decades of sanctions, US and European sanctions against Sudan, the Gulf are really the kind of more powerful actors here, and they're doing their own thing. They're not necessarily just doing the kind of bidding US empire here. So yeah, that to me is something that we haven't, and you know, as a result, you see some talk now in the media implicating the UAE, but it's like now, what, a year into this war, they've been involved since the very beginning, and there isn't any action behind that talk. Like, even if somebody in the White House mentions their negative role, they're not doing anything about it, you know? So.
Okay, so we only have about 4 minutes left, and so I want to give you guys a minute or two to make some final comments. And specifically, I want to end not with a false note of optimism, but to ask more directly is if there's anything that gives you hope about the situation in your countries right now, right? Is there anything on the horizon that you think could be a turning point in either one of these conflicts, and that gives you some degree of optimism, or not, right? And I think that's a perfectly acceptable response. And also to if you've mentioned a number of different organizations and initiatives that you are involved with, if you want to use this as an opportunity to let people know how they can support these local-led initiatives, this would be a great opportunity for you to do that as well. Okay, Nisrin, you want to take a minute or two to wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have that much optimism. I mean, I'm usually more optimistic among my Sudanese friends, but I think part of what being a student of Sudanese history has taught me is that wars in Sudan have historically taken a very long time to resolve themselves. And so I think that's a reality that we are all contending with at the moment. How do we then organize in the face of a war that could take years to resolve? And, you know, I think one of the things that gives me hope is that there are people in exile now, many members of the resistance committees in Kampala, Cairo, elsewhere, who are trying to sort of return to the labor of organizing a way of sort of crafting a vision for a way forward. And that needs to be taken seriously by the diaspora, by people who are in solidarity with the people on the ground. And I think generally what those same people have told me, who's located in the diaspora, is that we need to be guided by the people who are closest, who are most impacted by this war in terms of what solidarity will look like, and that really our organizing should be aimed at our own governments, right? The Canadian government's restrictive kind of racist immigration policies towards Sudan need to be challenged. The same goes for the US. They've extended TPS, but they haven't established a special visa program for Sudanese refugees. And the blueprint already exists, right? For Ukrainian refugees, it's a very robust blueprint that they can use. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration and the African communities together are working on kind of immigration policies that will impact Sudanese people. So please support their work.
And those are North American-based organizations, just to be clear.
Yes, based in, yeah. And then also I encourage you to support us at the Sudan Solidarity Collective. We're currently revamping our website. We've raised about 120,000 from small donations for these emergency response rooms over the last couple of months, and are continuing to try to sustain our support of the emergency response rooms. Because of the internet blackout, a lot of them had to shut down their communal kitchens. And so I think, you know, getting monthly donations would help us hugely to be able to sustain this work. And then lastly, and this is based on my research, I want us to not naturalize this war in Sudan, to not normalize it, to recognize that we are all on some level complicit in it, whether it's through our tax dollars that fund sort of, you know, international diplomatic efforts that are, you know, not moving us closer to civilian rule, or whether it's through our university endowments or pension funds that are, you know, tied to weapons manufacturing companies or mining companies that are benefiting. And to, you know, I think we all have to educate ourselves more about those connections. But in 2024, any war on this planet, we are implicated in. And so, and I think in the Horn of Africa, somehow in Africa in general, like, these wars are seen as very far away from us, but they're not. And so I think what that means is it's less about charity and more about how can we then stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan who have been negatively impacted by sort of our complicity, if you will. Yeah.
Thank you, and wonderfully put. Fred, we have just about a minute left, so some final thoughts.
Yeah, final thought that, I mean, I used to say, and I keep saying, activist is an optimist, otherwise you will continue to resist. What gives me hope is to be honest, the whole large number of young people, and I'm very young, but I'm saying young people like 10 years younger than me, who mobilize in and around this camp, and mostly around Goma Active. Goma Active, you can go to Instagram and Twitter accounts. I think they are very good at communicating. As Nassim was saying, in Sudan, this funded by very small contributions, but it's changed a lot in terms of what they can achieve. And I think one probably revolutionary thing that they're doing, as well as in Sudan, is to reinvent solidarity and humanitarianism in this region, where NGOs has took over for a long time, and they don't wait for them anymore today. I completely second what you were saying about not normalizing this conflict. It has lasted very long, but it's not normal, and somehow all of us we end up contributing to it in one way or another. People from Congo like to say that in every smartphone there is probably a component that comes from my country, but that to say it's not very far from you. This conflict, maybe in also chocolates and other coffee that you drink, you're taking, there's part of it. There is a lot of atrocities being committed in this region, and people here will need justice. I don't know what kind of justice will bring justice, to repeat myself, to these people, but at some point this have to stop, and people responsible for these atrocities here and there need to be called out.
I just want to thank both you, Nisrin and Fred, for taking the time to join us today. This was very powerful. We had a ton of questions in the comments. Unfortunately, we weren't able to answer all of them, but I hope you all will take the time to learn more about these conflicts and to read the work of Fred and Nisrin, who are both also just tremendous intellectuals in addition to the activism that they do. So thank you all for joining us. Deborah, I don't know if you want to say any final words, otherwise we'll wrap up.
I just wanted to second your thanks and to give a call out to Megan Olson's freshman high school class.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everyone.